Hey there, guys. Now, we all know that not everything is meant to last. And so, we have seen almost everything good there is take a head dive. Not empires, dynasties, civilizations, or even alliances live so long. And staying true to that principle, no business does either. We all love some video games every now and then. And if you're a passionate gamer, there is one name you will most certainly remember. Yes, that name is Sega. As formerly being one of the most popular video game producers in the world, Sega has really seen unparalleled success at its peak. But as we just said, all good things must end. Therefore, the case stands true with Sega. Where is it now? What does it do? And most importantly, what makes Sega so legendary? Let's take a look at all these and recap the rise and fall of Sega. Well, before we get into the story of how this amazing company went from defining our childhood at its prime to being a shadow of its former glory, we really need to ask ourselves what it is. So, what really is Sega? Sega Corporation, based in Shingawa, Tokyo, is a Japanese multinational video game and entertainment corporation. Sega of America and Sega Europe, the company's foreign operations, are based in Irvine, California and London, respectively. Sega Games, the company's division for arcade and home video game production, has been in its present form since 2020. Prior to then, the two divisions were split into Sega Games and Sega Interactive Co. Limited. Surprisingly, although it reached the height of its popularity in the 90s, Sega has its origins set much earlier than that. In fact, although the company is widely known to be Japanese, it began its journey halfway across the world on a completely different continent. In fact, you would be surprised to know that, in its truest sense, Sega's history goes all the way back to World War II. Back then, since there were a lot of US soldiers headed to war far away from home, morale needed to be maintained. One of the best ways of doing so was to offer good entertainment. And so, a group of three American businessmen, namely Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert, started making coin-based games in Honolulu, Hawaii. But after the government put a ban on slot games in the 50s, the founders, alongside Richard Stewart and Ray Lemaire, moved the corporation to Tokyo and named it Service Games of Japan. However, the US government drew the suspicion of this move and was planning on prosecuting the founders for unlawful business practices. Thus, on June 3, 1960, two key players in the organization, Richard Stewart and Martin Bromley, formed Nihon Goraku Busan. Almost immediately, Nihon Goraku Busan keenly purchased the assets of its predecessors, Service Games of Japan. Yes, if that comes as a surprise to you, this is what Sega was originally called, Nihon Goraku Busan. It was going to be 5 long years of an awkward and ill-marketed name before the company finally registered itself as Sega Enterprises Limited. This development came after Nihon Goraku Busan acquired all the assets of yet another company, Rosen Enterprises. At the time, Rosen Enterprises was one of the largest importers of coin or token-operated games in the region. This acquisition had obvious effects, as the newly found Sega Enterprises Limited was now able to monopolize the coin and token-operated gaming industry in the area. Now, with the stage all set, the company was ready to begin work on its first major production. In the 1960s, another Japanese video games manufacturer, Nakamura Manufacturing Co., later known as Namco, was working on an arcade game that was to redefine the contemporary gaming experience. The game they had come up with was initially called Torpedo Launcher. The game was an arcade game that was based on a submarine that would be shooting warships. Since it was a simulation game, it gained massive popularity as one of the most advanced simulation games of the time. Nevertheless, in 1966, Sega decided to move in on this plot. Sega partnered with Nakamura Manufacturing Co. and redesigned Torpedo Launcher to make certain improvements to the gaming experience. The new and redesigned game was renamed Periscope and was marketed once more from scratch under that name. Sega's Periscope was an unexpected hit. Due to the machine's size and impracticality at street-side sight, it fared well at bigger places such as malls and department shops, which generally did not host coin-operated arcade games. The game was a smash hit in Japan and subsequently rose to the top in both the United States and Europe. The game even won many awards, such as the Henry A. Gunther Trophy for being one of the most profound examples of coin-operated games. The game made more money than any other video game ever had up until that point. In fact, Periscope was such a hit that it redefined the concept of arcade games altogether. The game's massive success aided in the establishment of the $quarter-dollar coin-per-play premium game trend, which has since become the US market norm for all arcade games. And this was just the start that Sega was looking for. The high returns on investment in the game really made every stakeholder within the company happy. It also showed everyone that Sega was more than just acquiring former video games manufacturers. Sega was involved in the process on a much more personal level that is pretty close to home. And so, Sega's management gained confidence and morale that would help take the company to its peak as the world's greatest video games manufacturers. For the upcoming generations, Sega was all set to make itself almost synonymous with the word video games, even more so with arcade gaming. This seemed like the upward trajectory in Sega's story that it so desperately needed. After all, with the most successful video game in the market, nothing could possibly go wrong, right? Well, not so much. Although Sega was doing pretty good for itself to begin with, the company was under constant pressure by the United States due to the coin game ban that we just discussed previously. And so, Sega was sold once more to Gulf and Western Industries, an American business conglomerate. Although Gulf and Western Industries was originally founded to operate as a manufacturing and resource extraction firm, business was booming, and the conglomerate was moving rapidly into the entertainment industry. They had even bought off Paramount Pictures in 1966. But that acquisition was purely monetary, and a larger part of Sega's management hierarchy remained the same. Most importantly and most notably, David Rosen continued to hold his position as the company's CEO. The 1970s saw Sega's first major move from purely arcade gaming into the world of video games. With Sega Pong-Tron being released in 1973, Sega managed to create an almost perfect recreation of Atari's Pong. Atari, however, was new in the market at the time since it was founded only a year prior in 1972. So Sega's recreation of the game, coupled with its already amazing market reputation thanks to Periscope, to make the game a smash hit. Since personal computers were still not much of a norm back then, and neither were gaming consoles a common commodity, the Pong-Tron was largely available in arcade gaming centers and served Sega's interests well, as it was coupled with Periscope to provide a distinct Sega experience. Now, before we move further onto Sega's own legacy, we need to discuss something different for a bit. You see, in the late 1970s, there was a thing called the arcade video game boom. Alternatively, this period from the late 70s well into the 80s is still popularly known as the golden age of arcade video games. During this time, a booming craze of video-based arcade games was taking over the market. So much so that it developed into a culture of its own. As such, Sega saw itself blossom. Although the explosion of arcade video games during this time was not triggered by Sega, the company still saw tremendous growth. Originally, the boom owed itself to Taito's revolutionary video game that came out in 1978 called Space Shooters. The game itself was a breakthrough as it was the first game that introduced the fixed first shooter concept that gave birth to the entire shoot-'em-up genre of video games. Nevertheless, this golden age played a major role in catalyzing Sega's own growth as there was an increased demand for video games, and Sega was greatly benefiting from this growing market. Sega's revenue streams crossed the $100 million mark, and it had a lot of capital that it smartly reinvested in its own growth. But as its competitors, such as Taito, were focusing more on developing games, Sega was taking a more strategic approach by dominating the supply chain. This allowed Sega to maintain a substantial qualitative edge over its competitors. Sega purchased Gremlin Industry and Escobo Ueki during this market upturn. Both these purchases were a brilliant move, since Gremlin Industries was one of the chief manufacturers of microprocessor-based arcade games, and Escobo Ueki was a coin operating systems distributor. Both of these acquisitions meant that Sega was now better equipped to manufacture its own arcade and video games. This arcade gaming boom lasted for quite a while, and Sega managed to amass some crucial revenue for its upcoming operations. It used the money to brilliantly market itself as one of the most dominant competitors in the market, despite having less sales than Space Shooter for its own video games. Nevertheless, the marketing strategies were perfectly designed to make sure that Sega gets as much popularity as the public was willing to offer, often even becoming more famous than its own more successful counterparts. By the end of this boom in the early 80s, Sega had already crossed the $200 million mark for annual revenue. Instead of making games, Sega focused more on purchasing and positioning already popular games. This, in turn, enriched the company's own overall image as the industry leader. Of course, Sega was not totally out of the production process. Instead of being the sole producer, Sega worked towards establishing joint ventures and cooperative production. For example, Sega partnered with Konami in 1981 to produce Frogger. Konami was the main developer for the game, whilst Sega was the chief manufacturer. The game was, of course, a massive success, once more placing Sega at the forefront of the arcade video game experience. Prior to this, Sega had developed and distributed Head-On in 1979. Head-On was also a massive success, becoming one of the best-selling games for that same year. An interesting fact here is that Head-On was the first game that produced the dot-eating game genre and eventually ended up influencing the development of Pac-Man. Nearing the end of this arcade video game boom, Sega went on to produce Zaxxon. Once more, the company had introduced an idea that would more or less revolutionize the concept of video games for years to come. The game was the first ever produced to feature isometric graphics. This, in turn, creates a unique three-dimensional effect. So, it's safe to say that Sega was also the pioneer in the world of 3D graphics for video games. And with this, the arcade video game boom of the 70s and 80s gradually drew to an end. But amidst all this, Sega was now known on a much grander level, with popularity levels still rising in Japan and North America. Subsequently, the arcade gaming area was coming to a decline as personal computers and portable gaming consoles slowly moved into the picture. In parallel to this general decline, Sega also began to notice a gradual downward trajectory in its own arcade business by the end of 1983. Just as Sega had managed to do so up until now, the company realized that in order to compete with the changing market trends, it must continue in its own tradition of making well-timed and strategically thought-out moves. By 1983, Gulf and Western Enterprises had sold out the North American arcade manufacturing to Bally Manufacturing, as well as its licensing rights for the games in the region. Sega's North America R&D operation and its Japanese affiliate, Sega Enterprises Limited, were retained by Gulf and Western. Sega Enterprises Limited president Nakayama called for the firm to exploit its hardware knowledge to enter the Japanese home consumer market, using the company's declining arcade business as an example. And so, Sega chose to try its luck with something new. Sega was now manufacturing its own computers. By the end of the year, the company came out with the new SC3000. Around this time, Sega was facing immense competition from not what seemed like direct competitors, but from gaming consoles and PC gaming franchises that took out a large portion of Sega's arcade markets. At the very top of this newly developing and highly competitive market was another company that I'm sure we're all aware of: Nintendo. Nintendo was coming up with the Famicom, and estimates suggested that the console would take a very tough jab at the remainder of the arcade games market. As such, Sega realized the need to move into the console market and cut itself a nice slice of the action that this developing market promised. As such, another major breakthrough in the company's legacy came about: the SG-1000. This was supposed to mark the entry of Sega's business into the world of home video game consoles. Understandably, this console allowed Sega to enter the console-making industry. Of course, it was not a smash hit when compared to the Famicom, despite the fact that it managed to sell over 1.4 million units in Japan. Nevertheless, it was described by critics as being the Japanese forefathers of the Master System, as it was the console that allowed Sega to understand a whole new gaming market altogether. Finally, after having ruled over the company in its recent prime and introduced it to console making, David Rosen stepped down from the position of Sega's CEO in late 1983. The next in line was Jeffrey Rockless. This period was a little tough for Sega since there were massive readjustments being made to its overall management hierarchy. For starters, the founder of Gulf and Western Industries, Charles Bluedorn, fell ill and passed away. Immediately following his demise, the company made some major adjustments. Subsequently, it began to sell off its secondary businesses. Rosen and Nakayama, Sega's head of operations in Japan, arranged for the managerial body to buy out most of Sega. The buyers were given financial support by Japanese software firm CSK Corporation. Subsequently, all assets Sega had in Japan were bought for around $38 million, and chairmanship of the new board was given to CSK's head Isao Okawa. The company was now Sega Enterprises Limited, with Nakayama as its CEO. Nakayama came in with a vision to reposition Sega as a prominent player in the home-based video game console market. As such, he led the recreation of the SG-1000 in 1985. Alternatively, this console was called the Mark III, but the most popularity it had was through its rebranded title as the Master System. The Master System was an 8-bit, third-generation, home-based video gaming console. In comparison to its predecessors, the Master System had improved graphics capabilities. The Master System was first introduced in North America in 1986, then in Europe in 1987, and finally in Brazil in 1989. In 1990, North American, Australasia, and Europe received the Master System 2, a less expensive model. But above all, it was known to have made a reputation for itself owing to its futuristic design. Simply owning a Master System meant you were a top-of-the-line gamer in the 80s. Now, despite the fact that Sega managed to survive in the newly developing personal console market, it was still unable to dominate the market. It was still an underdog in the market. However, this time, more than strategy, it was going to be luck that helped Sega improve its position. The 90s brought a slightly different twist in market trends as the arcade market once more began to grow. Sega was one of the most well-known gaming brands during the end of the 1980s, when the arcade game business was once again flourishing. The business specialized in developing games that appeal to a wide range of preferences in arcades, such as racing games and side-scrollers. In the home-based gaming console market, however, Sega was still not in first place. When Nintendo launched the Super Famicom, Sega saw itself taking another jab. Sega had almost recently released the Mega Drive, a successor to the Master System. The Mega Drive came out into the Japanese market in 1988, but the console was sidelined largely by Super Mario Bros. 3. Clearly, Nintendo was doing something right that Sega was not figuring out just yet. Although 400,000 units were shipped by Sega in the first year, it was still only second place. The 16-bit era saw Sega drastically fall behind the Super Famicom and the NEC's P engine. Outside the Japanese market, the Mega Drive was better known as Sega Genesis. Sega's research and development department submitted various character concepts while looking for a flagship series to compete with Nintendo's Mario series. Their character design attempts yielded a variety of outcomes, including an armadillo. Nevertheless, the story of how Sonic the Hedgehog was born is worthy of an entire video of its own. Long story short, we got Sonic the Hedgehog. The core emphasis when designing Sonic, however, was going to be its ease in drawing by children, as well as the personality of the character. The personality was, therefore, shaped as whatever classified as cool for kids in the United States, as that was the largest market in question for Sega. Thankfully for Sega, this plan went on to work out really well. Sonic the Hedgehog was everything that kids in the mid-1990s needed. So, as Sonic rose to fame, so did Sega. Sonic the Hedgehog would go on to become one of the most successful video game franchises of all time. The Genesis outsold its major competition, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States, by roughly 2-1 during the 1991 Christmas season, thanks in large part to the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega had a 65% share in the 16-bit console market by January 1992. Due to the Genesis's head start, lower pricing, and greater library compared to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System at launch, Sega outsold Nintendo for 4 consecutive Christmas seasons. Sega was finally on top, no longer second place. Sega Saturn then came out as a successor to the Genesis in 1994. It was meant to be an improvement on the Sega Genesis, but was not a commercial success unlike anticipated. Nevertheless, the 16-bit era was drawing to an end, and Sega had to make sure that it was well equipped to enter the 32-bit market. Sega began work on the 32X, a Genesis follow-up that would be a more affordable way to enter the 32-bit era. The 32X would not work with the Saturn, but would be able to play Genesis games. The Sega 32X was launched on November 21, 1994 in North America and cost less than half the price of the Saturn at launch. Both the Saturn and 32X were aimed at bringing Sega users into the 32-bit world at different price brackets in an attempt to approach the market from both a price-competitive and quality-centric front. You would be surprised to realize that Saturn sold out all 200,000 units that were initially produced on the very first day. In fact, the PlayStation was new to the market and was largely overshadowed by Sega's gigantic market influence. But this time, luck was not going to favor Sega again. As soon as it launched in the United States, Sony's PlayStation outsold the Sega Saturn. Since the 32X was already ill-positioned to compare against the PlayStation, the Saturn was Sega's best bet. However, Sega's surprise early launch actually acted as a two-edged sword. The company failed to keep marketing pace with the hastened launch date, and there was not enough awareness about the console as it came out. It also had trouble supporting the new polygonal graphics. Overall, the PlayStation was better and more comprehensively marketed, cheaper, and did not bite off more than it could chew. As such, Sega learned that quality would always trump popularity. This massive blunder and PlayStation's surprisingly amazing experience meant that Sega was effectively slaughtered in the home-based console gaming market. It was not only Sega though. Nintendo saw fierce competition from the PlayStation 2. And as such, Sony seemed to be the new dominant force in the market, outdoing previous players that seemed to have been irreplaceable until now. Of course, Sega was hopeless. The Dreamcast was Sega's attempt to regain the market. Despite a 75% decline in half-year revenues immediately before the Dreamcast's Japanese debut, Sega was optimistic through its new system. The Dreamcast gained a lot of attention and a lot of pre-orders. Sonic Adventure, the next game starring Sega's mascot Sonic the Hedgehog, will be a Dreamcast launch title, Sega said. Sega, on the other hand, was unable to supply enough Dreamcast systems for the Japanese launch due to a high failure rate in the production process. Sega halted pre-orders in Japan after more than half of its limited stock had been pre-ordered. Despite the fact that the Dreamcast was immensely popular, it still lacked domination of the market share. Sony still held over 60% of the market through the PlayStation, and Sega was falling behind. This time, however, Sega was hit a bit too hard. It seemed like the company had invested almost everything in the Dreamcast development and marketing program. There on out, the company was always struggling to make ends meet and keep operations running. With consecutive releases, Sony kept dominating the gaming console market, and Sega was unable to revive itself. As such, new competitors also began to enter. With such fierce competition and the new driving out the old, Sega saw no room for re-entry. Instead, Sega sought to recover its corporate functions and focused its attention to becoming a third-party software developer instead. CSK's head and Sega's board chairman Isao Okawa advocated that Sega pull out of the console business altogether. Nevertheless, the gaming giant has fallen. In Sega's legacy, we realize that it is important to always keep focused and to never let overconfidence blur your judgment. Still, we all remember and love Sega for the amazing memories it has given us 90s kids, and especially the contribution to the world of gaming. Even more so, we still love and cherish Sonic the Hedgehog. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, remember to leave a like and comment on what Sega console was your favorite. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. Thanks for watching.